The morning mist clung to the York River like a shroud of destiny on September 28, 1781. General George Washington stood atop his horse, surveying the sprawling British fortifications of Yorktown through his spyglass. After 6 grueling years of revolution, the moment he had dreamed of was finally within reach. Lord Charles Cornwallis and his entire Southern army were trapped on a narrow peninsula, with nowhere to run. Washington's weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as he watched the combined Franco-American forces take their positions. To his left, the white uniforms of the French regulars under the Marquis de Lafayette gleamed in the early sunlight. To his right, his own Continental soldiers, battle-hardened and determined, prepared their siege equipment with methodical precision. The irony was not lost on him after years of begging for French support. Here they were at last, shoulder to shoulder with his ragged colonials, ready to deliver the killing blow to British hopes in America. The path to this moment had been treacherous and uncertain. Just months earlier, Cornwallis had seemed unstoppable, carving a path of destruction through the Carolinas and Virginia. His army of 7,000 seasoned British and Hessian troops had established what they believed to be an impregnable position at Yorktown, expecting the Royal Navy to maintain control of the Chesapeake Bay and provide an escape route if needed. But Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse had arrived first with the French fleet, cutting off Cornwallis from the sea and sealing his fate. As referenced in David McCullough's acclaimed work, 1776, Washington had learned to be patient, to wait for the perfect moment to strike decisively rather than risk everything on desperate gambles. The Allied commanders had worked through the night, finalizing their siege plans. Washington commanded approximately 8,000 Continental troops, while his French allies under Lieutenant General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Weimar, Comte de Rochambeau, brought another 7,000 professional soldiers. The combined force of 15,000 men represented the largest army Washington had ever commanded, and certainly the most professional and well-equipped. Cornwallis, trapped behind his earthworks, could only watch as the noose tightened around Yorktown. His attempts to break out had been thwarted, and his desperate messages to General Henry Clinton in New York had gone unanswered. The British general, who had terrorized the South, now found himself in an impossible position. Surrounded on land by overwhelming numbers and blockaded at sea by French warships, the siege line stretched in a great arc around the town, with Allied artillery positions being constructed within range of the British defenses. Washington knew that this would be a methodical, professional siege in the European tradition, not the hit-and-run warfare that had characterized much of the Revolution. The presence of French engineers and artillery specialists meant they could conduct a proper siege with parallel trenches, saps, and battery positions that would systematically reduce the British fortifications. As the sun climbed higher, Washington felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. Everything the Revolution had fought for, independence, liberty, the right to self-governance, hung in the balance at this small Virginia tobacco port. If they succeeded here, the war would essentially be over. If they failed, the British might yet find a way to prolong the conflict indefinitely. October 1st, 1781. Dawn crisp and clear as the first Allied artillery pieces roared to life, their thunderous voices echoing across the Virginia Peninsula. Washington stood in his command post, watching through his telescope as British soldiers scrambled for cover behind their redoubts. The siege of Yorktown had begun in earnest, and every cannonball that crashed into the enemy lines brought American independence one step closer to reality. The combined Franco-American artillery bombardment was unlike anything the colonials had been able to mount during the entire war. French engineers had positioned their heavy siege guns with mathematical precision, each battery carefully sighted to create interlocking fields of fire that left no safe corner within the British defenses. The continuous roar of cannon fire created a hellish symphony that could be heard for miles in every direction. Cornwallis had made his headquarters in a cave beneath the bluffs, seeking shelter from the relentless bombardment that was systematically destroying his army's morale and fighting capability. His aide-de-camp, Captain Alexander Ross, reported that the Allied guns were firing nearly continuously, with French 24-pounders and American 18-pounders working in deadly harmony to reduce the British fortifications to rubble. The first parallel trench had been completed under cover of darkness, bringing the Allied siege lines to within 600 yards of the main British works. French sappers, masters of siege warfare honed through decades of European conflicts, directed the digging with professional expertise that impressed even Washington's veteran officers. The zigzag approach trenches snaked toward the British lines, like deadly serpents, each night bringing them closer to their prey. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, marveled at the efficiency of the French military machine. Their engineers worked with clockwork precision. Their artillery officers calculated firing solutions with mathematical accuracy, and their infantry maintained perfect discipline under fire. This was professional warfare at its highest level, far removed from the desperate improvisation that had characterized much of the American war effort. By October 4th, the Allies had established their second parallel, this one only 300 yards from the British lines. The concentrated firepower from this closer position began to tell dramatically on the enemy defenses. British artillery pieces were dismounted one by one, their gun crews decimated by accurate allied fire. The elegant Georgian houses of Yorktown were reduced to smoking ruins, and the British soldiers huddled in their bunkers like trapped animals. Washington maintained his headquarters in the Morehouse, from where he could observe the siege operations and coordinate with his French counterparts. The cooperation between American and French forces had exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Rochambeau, despite commanding a force nearly equal to Washington's own, had graciously accepted the Americans' overall command and worked seamlessly to integrate their operations. The psychological impact of the siege was perhaps even more devastating than the physical destruction. British deserters began slipping across the lines nightly, reporting that morale within Yorktown was collapsing. Cornwallis had promised his men that relief was coming from New York, but as the days passed with no sign of the Royal Navy, even the most loyal soldiers began to doubt their commander's assurances. On October 6th, the Allies opened their second battery, bringing even more guns to bear on the shrinking British perimeter. The systematic destruction of Yorktown proceeded with remorseless efficiency, each day bringing fresh evidence that Cornwallis's position was becoming untenable. British attempts to sally forth and spike the Allied guns were beaten back with heavy losses, and their own artillery was being steadily silenced by superior enemy firepower. As night fell on October 6th, Washington allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The siege was proceeding exactly according to plan, and barring some unforeseen catastrophe, Cornwallis would soon be forced to surrender his entire army. The pre-dawn darkness of October 14th, 1781, was shattered by the war cries of American and French assault troops as they stormed the last of British redoubts. Standing between the Allied forces and complete victory, Washington watched from his command post as two separate columns of infantry, one American and one French, launched simultaneous attacks on redoubts 9 and 10. The final obstacles to closing the siege ring round Cornwallis completely. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton led the American assault on Redoubt 10, with 400 men from the 1st and 2nd New York regiments, along with Connecticut and Rhode Island troops. The young officer had specifically requested this dangerous honor, arguing that his years of staff duty had kept him from the glory of battlefield command. Washington had reluctantly agreed, knowing that Hamilton's courage and tactical skill made him the right man for such a crucial mission. The French, meanwhile, launched their own attack on Redoubt 9 under Lieutenant Colonel Guillaume de Dupont, leading 600 grenadiers and chasseurs of the Royal Dupont's regiment. The coordination between the two assaults was perfect, timed to prevent the British from concentrating their fire on either attack force. Both redoubts were small, but strongly fortified positions, surrounded by abattis and defended by determined British and Hessian troops who knew that defeat meant the end of their army. Hamilton's men advanced in perfect silence until they reached the abattis, then erupted in cheers as they hacked their way through the wooden obstacles with axes and bayonets. The British defenders, caught by surprise, fired a devastating volley that dropped several Americans, but Hamilton's troops pressed forward with irresistible momentum. The young colonel was among the first to leap into the redoubt, his sword flashing in the darkness as he led his men in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Simultaneously, the French assault on Redoubt 9 proceeded with typical Gallic élan. Dupont's grenadiers stormed over the earthworks with fixed bayonets, their white uniforms ghostly in the pre-dawn light. The Hessian defenders fought with characteristic stubbornness, but they were overwhelmed by superior numbers and the fury of troops, who sensed victory within their grasp. Within 20 minutes, both redoubts had fallen to the Allied assault. The cost had been relatively light, less than 30 killed and wounded in both attacks combined. But the strategic impact was enormous. With the capture of these final outworks, Washington could now position his artillery to bombard every square yard of the British position. Cornwallis was completely trapped, with no possibility of escape or effective resistance. The fall of the redoubts marked the beginning of the end for British resistance. Allied engineers immediately began extending their siege lines to incorporate the captured positions, and heavy artillery was hauled forward to point-blank range of the main British works. The systematic destruction of Yorktown could now proceed to its inevitable conclusion. Cornwallis, observing the disaster from his underground headquarters, finally began to face the reality that his situation was hopeless. His artillery had been almost completely silenced, his men were dying daily from disease and allied fire, and his supplies were nearly exhausted. The promised relief from New York remained a fantasy, and Admiral de Grasse's fleet continued to control the Chesapeake, making escape by sea impossible. On the morning of October 15th, Cornwallis made a desperate attempt to evacuate his army across the York River to Gloucester Point, where a smaller British force under Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton held a secondary position. But a violent storm scattered the small boats during the night crossing, stranding most of the troops on the Yorktown side and making it clear that even this last gamble had failed. Washington consolidated his gains methodically, bringing more artillery forward and preparing for a final bombardment that would make the British position completely untenable. The Allied guns now numbered more than 100 pieces, all positioned within devastating range of the shrinking British perimeter. The systematic destruction of Cornwallis's army was about to reach its climax. As October 15th drew to a close, both armies knew that the end was near. The question was no longer whether Cornwallis would surrender, but when and on what terms. The morning of October 17th, 1781, began like any other day of the siege, with Allied artillery pounding the British works with methodical precision. But at 10 o'clock, something extraordinary happened that would echo through the corridors of history forever. A lone drummer boy appeared on the British parapet, beating the chamade, the traditional signal for parley. Though his drumbeat was nearly drowned out by the thunder of cannon, sharp-eyed American officers spotted the white flag he carried and quickly ordered a ceasefire. Washington stood motionless in his command post as the guns fell silent one by one, the sudden quiet almost more startling than the constant bombardment had been. After 19 days of siege and 6 years of revolution, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Through his spyglass, he watched as a British officer emerged from the battered fortifications carrying a flag of truce, walking steadily toward the American lines despite the debris and destruction surrounding him. The British emissary was Major William Coke, Cornwallis's aide-de-camp, who carried a letter addressed to Washington requesting a 24-hour cessation of hostilities to discuss terms for surrender. The message was brief and formal, but Washington could read between the lines. Lord Cornwallis, the architect of British strategy in the South, was ready to admit defeat and surrender his entire army. The American commander maintained his composure, but inside he felt a surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. After Valley Forge, after the dark winter retreats, after years of begging Congress for supplies and men, after watching his army nearly dissolve from hunger and cold, victory was finally within his grasp. But Washington was to experience a soldier to count his triumph before the terms were signed and sealed. Cornwallis had chosen October 17th for his surrender offer. With bitter irony, it was exactly 4 years to the day since British General John Burgoyne had surrendered his army at Saratoga, the victory that had brought France into the war and made this moment possible. The British commander, trapped in his cave headquarters with shells bursting overhead and his army dying around him, had finally acknowledged that his situation was hopeless. The negotiations that followed were conducted with the formal courtesy that characterized 18th century warfare between professional armies. Washington appointed Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence, son of former Continental Congress President Henry Lawrence, and the Vicomte de Noailles, Lafayette's brother-in-law, as his commissioners to meet with British representatives and work out the surrender terms. Cornwallis, perhaps hoping that his reputation as a gentleman and his past courtesies to American prisoners might earn him favorable treatment, requested terms that would allow his army to march out with full military honors, their flags flying and bands playing. But Washington, remembering the humiliating surrender terms imposed on American forces at Charleston the previous year, firmly rejected such generous conditions. The American commander insisted on exactly the same terms that Cornwallis had imposed. On General Benjamin Lincoln at Charleston, the British would march out with shouldered arms and case colors, forbidden from playing any American or French tunes. The symbolic humiliation would be complete and deliberate, a pointed reminder that the tables had turned completely since the dark days of 1780. As the negotiations continued through the afternoon and evening, both armies waited in tense silence. Allied soldiers cleaned their weapons and prepared their uniforms for the surrender ceremony, while British troops destroyed their equipment and personal belongings, rather than see them fall into enemy hands. The air was thick with anticipation and the acrid smoke of countless fires as the losers burned what they could not bear to surrender. Washington spent the evening reviewing the proposed articles of capitulation, ensuring that every detail was precisely worded to prevent any future disputes. He knew that this document would be studied by historians for generations, and he was determined that it should reflect not only American military victory, but also the emergence of the United States as a sovereign nation worthy of respect among the powers of Europe. By the morning of October 18th, the terms had been agreed upon and signed by all parties. Cornwallis would surrender his entire army, nearly 8,000 men, along with all their weapons, supplies, and equipment. October 19th, 1781, dawn clear and cool. Perfect weather for what would become the most significant surrender ceremony in American military history. Washington had spent the early morning hours reviewing every detail of the proceedings, determined that this moment should reflect the dignity and professionalism of his Continental Army. After 6 years of fighting a guerrilla war with inadequate supplies and inexperienced troops, he wanted the world to see that America had finally fielded an army worthy of its cause. The formal surrender was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, giving both armies time to prepare for the historic ceremony. Allied troops spent the morning cleaning their uniforms and polishing their weapons, while their officers reviewed the precise protocol that would govern every aspect of the proceedings. Washington had insisted on military perfection. This would be no ragged colonial rabble accepting a British surrender, but a professional army conducting itself with the dignity befitting a sovereign nation. The surrender field stretched for more than a mile between Yorktown and the Allied siege lines, with French forces drawn up on one side and Americans on the other, creating a corridor down which the defeated British would march. The Marquis de Lafayette commanded the American right wing, while Baron von Steuben, the Prussian drillmaster who had transformed Washington's army at Valley Forge, supervised the left. The precision of their formations would have done credit to any European army. At precisely 2 o'clock, the British garrison began its march of shame from the battered fortifications of Yorktown. While Lord Cornwallis himself was notably absent, pleading illness, he had delegated the humiliating duty to his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. The British commander's absence was seen by many as an admission that he could not bear to face Washington personally. In the moment of his ultimate defeat, O'Hara led the melancholy procession on horseback, followed by the remnants of some of Britain's finest regiments, the 23rd Foot, the 33rd Foot, the 71st Highland Regiment units that had terrorized the American South. For 2 years now marched with shouldered arms and case colors toward their captors. Their red uniforms were faded and patched, their faces gone from weeks of siege, but they maintained their military bearing even in defeat. The British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," a popular tune whose title seemed perfectly appropriate for the revolutionary moment unfolding before thousands of witnesses. The melody drifted across the Virginia countryside, a melancholy soundtrack to the end of British hopes in America. Many of the marching soldiers wept openly, knowing that their surrender meant not just personal humiliation, but the probable loss of Britain's most valuable colonial empire. When O'Hara approached the Allied commanders, he attempted to surrender his sword to Rochambeau rather than Washington, perhaps hoping to minimize the symbolic impact of British defeat at American hands. But the French general, with perfect diplomatic courtesy, declined the honor and directed O'Hara to the American commander. Washington, in turn, refused to accept the surrender personally from a subordinate officer, instead directing O'Hara to present his sword to General Benjamin Lincoln, the same officer who had been forced to surrender Charleston to Cornwallis the previous year. The symbolic reversal was complete and deliberate. Lincoln, who had endured the humiliation of Charleston's fall, now had the supreme satisfaction of accepting the surrender of the army that had defeated him. The circle of revenge was closed, and American honor was fully restored after the disasters of 1780. As each British regiment reached the designated point, They were ordered to ground their arms and lay down their equipment in growing piles. That represented the material wealth of a defeated army. Muskets, cartridge boxes, bayonets, and personal equipment created small mountains of military hardware that would soon be redistributed to the Continental Army. The surrender of each unit was marked by a formal ceremony that emphasized the completeness of British defeat. The entire process took more than 3 hours, as nearly 7,000 British and Hessian soldiers laid down their arms under the watchful eyes of their captors. Washington maintained his dignity throughout the long ceremony, but observers noted tears in his eyes as he realized that American independence was finally secure. The sun was setting over the York River on October 19, 1781, as Washington walked through the surrendered British camp, surveying the fruits of the greatest victory in American military history. Everywhere he looked lay the evidence of Cornwallis's defeat, abandoned artillery pieces, mountains of surrendered weapons, and the dejected faces of nearly 8,000 prisoners who had once formed the backbone of British power in the South. The material bounty captured at Yorktown was staggering by the standards of the Continental Army, which had spent 6 years fighting on starvation rations and cast-off equipment. The British had surrendered more than 200 cannon, thousands of small arms, vast quantities of ammunition, and military supplies worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. For an army that had often gone barefoot and unfed, such wealth seemed almost miraculous. But the true significance of the victory extended far beyond mere military hardware. Washington understood that Yorktown represented a fundamental shift in the global balance of power, the moment when American independence ceased to be a desperate colonial rebellion and became an accomplished fact that even Britain would be forced to recognize. The psychological impact of Cornwallis's surrender would resonate through the halls of power in London, Paris, and every European capital. The treatment of prisoners became Washington's immediate concern, and he was determined to handle this responsibility in a manner that would reflect credit on American arms and principles. Unlike the harsh treatment often meted out to captured Americans, the British and Hessian prisoners were provided with adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Washington knew that European observers were watching carefully to see whether the Americans could conduct themselves as a civilized nation worthy of international recognition. Lord Cornwallis, emerging from his headquarters cave for the first time since the surrender, requested a private meeting with Washington to discuss the fate of his army and the logistics of the prisoner exchange process. The two commanders met in the Moore House on October 20th, their first face-to-face encounter since the siege began. Both men maintained the courtesy expected of 18th century gentlemen, but the power relationship between them had been completely reversed. The captured British general attempted to negotiate better terms for his men, particularly regarding the fate of loyalist troops who had served with his army and now faced possible execution as traitors. Washington, displaying the magnanimity and victory that would characterize his entire career, agreed to protect loyalist prisoners and ensure their humane treatment, despite pressure from some American officers who wanted harsh revenge for years of British atrocities. News of the victory spread across America with remarkable speed, carried by express riders who covered hundreds of miles to bring word of Cornwallis's surrender to every major city. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress ordered special Thanksgiving services and authorized the striking of commemorative medals. Church bells rang from Boston to Savannah, and celebratory bonfires lit the night sky in countless towns and villages. The international implications of Yorktown were even more dramatic than its domestic impact. In London, Lord North allegedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over," when he received news of Cornwallis's surrender, recognizing immediately that British will to continue the war had been broken. Parliament began debating peace negotiations within weeks, and King George III was forced to accept that his American colonies were lost forever. French reaction was equally significant, as King Louis XVI and his ministers realized that their investment in the American cause had finally paid dividends. The victory vindicated French strategy and provided them with powerful leverage in their continuing global struggle against British hegemony. Admiral de Grasse, whose fleet had made the victory possible, was hailed as a hero in Versailles and promoted to higher command. Washington spent his final days at Yorktown, writing dispatches to Congress, state governors, and foreign allies, carefully crafting the narrative of American victory for maximum political impact. He understood that the battle for independence was not yet completely won. Formal peace negotiations would take months or years to complete, But Yorktown had created the conditions under which those negotiations could succeed. As the Allied Army prepared to break camp and march north, Washington took one last look at the battlefield that had decided America's fate. The siege lines were already being filled in, and local farmers were beginning to reclaim their fields from the devastation of war. 3 months after the surrender at Yorktown, Washington stood in his headquarters at Newburgh, New York, reading dispatches from London that confirmed what he had known since October 19th. The war was effectively over. Lord North's government had fallen, and the new British ministry under Lord Rockingham was actively seeking peace negotiations. The impossible dream of American independence, born in the halls of Philadelphia 6 years earlier, had finally become political reality through the crucible of war. The months following Yorktown had been filled with the complex logistics of victory processing, thousands of prisoners, redistributing captured equipment, and managing the delicate transition from active warfare to uncertain peace. Washington had used this time to cement the political gains won by military victory, corresponding with European allies and American political leaders, to shape the emerging peace settlement in America's favor. The British evacuation of Savannah and Charleston proceeded smoothly through the winter and spring of 1782, as Lord Cornwallis's defeat had made further resistance in the South impossible. The elaborate network of British fortifications and loyalist militias that had once seemed so formidable simply collapsed when deprived of regular army support. American forces reoccupied territory that had been lost for years, often finding that local patriots had already driven out their tormentors. Perhaps most significantly, Yorktown had transformed America's international standing from that of rebellious colonists to that of a legitimate nation-state worthy of diplomatic recognition. The Continental Congress received formal acknowledgement from the Netherlands, Spain, and numerous German principalities, while French support evolved from covert assistance to open alliance. American diplomatic representatives in European capitals found doors that had been closed for years suddenly opened to them. The French alliance, sealed in blood at Yorktown, would prove to be one of the most consequential diplomatic relationships in American history. The professional competence displayed by Washington's army during the siege had convinced French observers that America could be a valuable partner in their ongoing struggle against British global dominance. This partnership would shape American foreign policy for decades to come and play a crucial role in the nation's early development. As referenced in Joseph Ellis's masterful biography, His Excellency George Washington, the victory at Yorktown established Washington's reputation not just as a successful general, but as a statesman capable of managing complex international relationships and maintaining civilian control over military power. For Washington personally, Yorktown represented the culmination of a remarkable transformation. From Virginia planter to international figure, the man who had suffered humiliating defeats at Long Island and Brandywine had finally achieved the decisive victory that justified years of sacrifice and struggle. More importantly, he had demonstrated that American democracy could produce military leadership capable of competing with Europe's finest professional armies. The soldiers who had served in the siege would carry their memories of Yorktown for the rest of their lives, and many would play important roles in building the new nation they had helped to create. Alexander Hamilton would become the first Secretary of the Treasury, using financial skills honed during his military service to establish America's economic foundations. The Marquis de Lafayette would return to France as a hero, carrying American democratic ideals that would help spark the French Revolution. The formal Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, finally ended the war that Yorktown had decided nearly 2 years earlier. British recognition of American independence, territorial concessions extending American borders to the Mississippi River, and favorable commercial provisions all flowed from the negotiating position that Washington's victory had created. But perhaps the most important legacy of Yorktown was the precedent it established for American military excellence and democratic governance. Washington's decision to resign his commission and return to civilian life, rather than use his military success to establish a dictatorship, amazed European observers and established the principle of civilian control over the military that remains fundamental to American democracy. As Washington prepared to return to Mount Vernon and the peaceful life of a Virginia planter, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him from the desperate crossing of the Delaware to the triumph at Yorktown. The Continental Army he had commanded through 6 years of war had evolved from a collection of colonial militias into a professional fighting force, capable of defeating the world's most powerful military machine. The Battle of Yorktown had ended. More than just a war, it had announced the birth of a new nation and a new form of government, based on principles that would inspire democratic movements around the world for centuries to come.